somebody a lot of us in the region know very well. So I feel like she doesn't need any introduction, but just to give a quick and short intro. Shuyin is based in Vietnam. She is the partner at Patamar Capital and also is very involved in the leadership of the Beacon Fund in the region. He has been somebody we all look up to, both in the impact investing space as well as the gender lens investing space. And she has been quite active in investing in the region, setting up funds, supporting early stage social ventures, many with gender lens investment mandates. And she's also in the past been chosen as one of the 100 women of influence by one of the Australian Financial Review magazines. And I think, Shuyin, you continue to exert that influence in the space, not just with your thinking, but also with the work that you're constantly doing. So really excited to have you here today, and maybe give a quick, your intro as you talk about your work and how you landed in the investment/GLI field. Let's start with that. And then, of course, I have a few questions which are very technical and more specific for the session today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you've already heard a little bit about me. Essentially, I have been doing early stage investing in the region, specifically Vietnam. I'm in Southeast Asia for the past 10 years. So it's been quite a journey. My first introduction personally to GLI came about in 2017. To be honest, before that, hadn't really heard of such a thing. When we were awarded a mandate to manage one of the first gender lens investing funds in the region. This was for the Investing in Women program of the Australian government. So that was definitely an eye-opener. I think, through that program, we actually learned about gender lens investing for the first time. For me personally, it corrected one of the big misperceptions that I had. I thought GLI was just about investing in women entrepreneurs, as I'm sure we all appreciate on this call. It actually is a lot more nuanced, right, and sophisticated than that. Although, of course, supporting women-led companies is a big part of the strategy. So yeah, I think today happy to share a little bit about our journey, how we implemented a gender lens throughout our different funds. Maybe some background or scene setting. Let me share a little bit about the funds that we manage, which I actually think illustrates a really key point, which is that a GLI can be incorporated into a fund strategy in a variety of different ways. So for two of our funds, that's the Investing in Women Fund and the Beacon Fund, gender is really at the forefront, right? I mean, we're investing in women-owned and women-led businesses. We're conducting pretty in-depth due diligence on gender in the business as we look at all of the companies. And finally, in terms of the way that we construct our own investment decision-making process, we've really done that in a way to make sure that there are diverse decision makers at every level, right? So I think those two funds, I would say, gender, those funds are really all about gender, right? At the same time, though, we also have two other funds where, gender is more of a lens, right? It isn't actually the core principle of the fund. We're pretty upfront about that. And we also think that's okay. And it doesn't make them, say, any less authentic, right, than another gender lens fund. So the core principle or core thesis of those funds is really about investing in early stage technology companies to transform the lives of Southeast Asia's emerging middle class. Gender is, overlay, right? One of the factors that we consider, but I think that we wouldn't say it's actually a primary driver. And so happy to talk about different distinctions and how we kind of sometimes thread that needle on positioning the different funds. But I think it was a big takeaway for us. Gender doesn't have to be the core thesis of every fund, right? It could be just a consideration, and that's actually that actually can make a compelling thesis as well.
Could you talk about typically the kind of enterprises you consider when you're looking at early stage investing, what profile they have, and how do you match their profile with the fund thesis and the objective you have? And again, I know you mentioned in your introduction about how you came to know about GLI initially when IW approached you on this. So just curious of how you started building the fund thesis to actually work to make GLI as a core part of the fund thesis itself.
Yeah, so I think maybe let me start with the venture capital side, right, or the VC side of our work. So we run a number of different funds with more VC style strategies, right? And let me talk about how we incorporated gender lens into those different funds. So I think we will, I'm sure, get there, right? But I think basically the first step that we did was we really took our entire fund investment process and we really tried to break it down from origination to structuring, due diligence, right? And then of course, portfolio management. And we tried to think about, how can we, where does gender play a role, right? Where might we be missing something? Where are there new opportunities for us to capture? So I think you asked about like who exactly are we investing in, right? So on the VC side, we typically invest in seed and Series A companies. So pretty early stage, right? $500,000 to $2 million checks, right? And let's start, say, with pipeline. How do we actually increase the companies coming to us, right? That either have female founders, right? Have gender as a strong consideration in the business. I think it's kind of simple things, but I think it was about us actually going ahead and doing them. I think the first one is the very simple step, right, of making it known that, gender is actually something we're interested in. We're interested in meeting more female founders, right? We're interested in meeting more businesses who are targeting women. I think that's number one. So we made a very conscientious or concerted effort, right, to attend a broader set of events, which really targeted, say, female founders. And I think simple things like that, speaking at those events, having a presence at those events, letting people know that it's important to us, I think already began to make a difference in the pipeline that we saw. I think another thing, was more an internal transformation step. So really thinking through, our own practices and increasing actually the diversity of our team. So I think we noticed that made us a lot more approachable for female founders, for example, to show that, hey, we also have a team which does reflect the diversity of experiences out there. And I think we went actually from a team which had, slightly majority men to slightly majority women at this time. This is the investment team. And I think we thought that was a big, again, a shift that I think also really did influence, say, the pipeline that we saw. That's a little bit more on, I think some stuff, I'm sure you've heard some of these strategies before on, in terms of deal sourcing. I think one kind of quite interesting thing, or one interesting opportunity that, gender smart investing really illustrated for us was it opened up a whole new kind of area of investment, or a new fund thesis. So I think one of the things that we noticed when we were really actively trying to seek more female founders, right, and women-led businesses, is that we noticed that many of the founders that we met were not actually that same kind of so-called like typical like tech entrepreneur, right, who was building, say, a highly scalable business, right, with exponential growth potential, and really, had this dream of, building it to being $1 billion a unicorn and doing an IPO. We actually came across many female founders, and I'm wondering if this is true of your experience as well, who had, a business with a more stable or kind of moderate growth path, right? They were definitely still growing. So they were still growing, were more focused on sustainable growth, right? Achieving cash flow positivity or profitability. And at the same, despite all of these good characteristics, right? Being profitable, cash flow positive, et cetera, really struggled to access financing from either VC or PE firms, as well as the banks. And, we actually created a whole new fund called the Beacon Fund to tap into that whole strategy. So I think, honestly, without applying, say, a gender lens, right, or specifically making that effort to outreach more to female entrepreneurs, I'm not sure whether we would have seen this opportunity as clearly, right? And I think that actually gave us the impetus to launch a whole new fund, right? And which was actually, quite successful in raising capital, right? We've, begun deploying as well, and it unlocked a whole new segment for us to invest in at Patamar. I think with good financial potential, but I think also great impact as well. Because I think this missing middle, right, which we often talk about, say, in the impact investing world. This is a gap which we still see very clearly and very starkly in the regions where we invest.
I think just double clicking on the whole pipeline building and deal origination front, could you talk a little bit more about, you said that you attended, you and the team attended like events where you could find the likely sort of prospects. What else? Like what else works? And again, this might be things that you may have tried, or other things that you have worked, best practices, other things that you've seen working in the space, because I think that's something that almost becomes like the first barrier.
One other thing that we realized was that often, I mean, we hear it all the time, right? You know, founders can only get access to investors through like pre-existing networks, right? And I think, you know, women are often disadvantaged in that regard. So I think one thing that we've tried with the Beacon Fund is to actually have a more standard kind of, say, application process, right? So there's always a way that people can reach out to us, fill in some information, and we'll get back to you. Again, this is definitely not rocket science, right? I'm not saying it's some huge kind of innovation, right, in like fund management or technology, but it's true, right? I mean, honestly, if you talk to the experience of many female founders, their experience is to be like ghosted, right, by investors or VCs, et cetera. And I think even having a simple mechanism where we say, hey, reach out to us, right, we'll get back to you, even if it's a no. And for sure, often the times that it is a no, I have to say, right, I mean, that it doesn't change some of the fundamentals of our, you know, investment decision making, but at least we can be found, right? And I think that that's a very simple thing, say on the pipeline side, which is more encouraging rather than like, oh, you only, you know, you have to find somebody who knows somebody. And for many, you know, for many founders, I think both male and female, but especially female, I think that can be already a huge barrier, right? To just get, you know, get their foot in the door, right? And even be able to pitch their business.
Talking about deal structuring, you know, when you look at your conversations with potential investees and deal structuring, what are some of the ways in which a strong gender lens can you see being applied here, and what kind of entry points and levels do you use?
Yeah, I think when it comes to, say, due diligence and deal structuring, I think this took us I will admit, this took us some time to get right? And I think my biggest advice or takeaway here is that, you know, you do have to find something which really makes sense, feels very authentic to, you know, for your firm, and I think also your team. So I think, you know, we're in the beginning, so this is, you know, rewind back to 2017, we're like, what should we do, right? Should we have, you know, a checklist of questions asking, say, companies about their gender practices, right? And then we're like, oh, but, you know, we invest in different sectors. How are we going to make it applicable to all of the different companies, right? And then that also seems a bit like a check the box. It's like, hey, companies, fill in the survey, right? Fill in the number of women you have or the percentage of women you have on your board, et cetera. That doesn't really, or makes people think a little bit, right? But we think maybe people can be kind of pushed a little bit further, right? So we're like, okay, that's not going to work. And then we went right in the other direction, and we developed a very long kind of comprehensive document which would guide our team on how to do gender analysis. But then, you know, I have to admit that kind of seemed a bit too theoretical, right? It read a little bit more like a paper, right, or a thesis from a gender studies, you know, master's or something, which was then, there's of course nothing wrong with that, right? I think that type of analysis is, you know, can be very insightful, except it wasn't something that the investment team could readily remember, right? And I think if we asked our team to conduct that type of analysis for every deal, frankly, they just, you know, wouldn't do it, right? And that doesn't get us to the outcome that we would like to see either. So I think where we landed was somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, right? So we basically came up with a 2-page kind of set of conversation starters, right? And they were structured into questions around the market, right, or industry or sector. Then another set around, say, the customer and the understanding of the customer of the company, and then about the company's internal practices themselves, right? And so we basically empowered our investment team with this list, and we also had training as well, and really told them, hey, you know, in your due diligence conversations with this company, weave some of these questions in, right? If you're asking the company about, say, their customer base, right? Obviously something that needs to be understood anyway, then start asking those questions, right? It can be as simple as like, okay, what percentage of your customers are female? Okay, you get some headline answer, but then you can, again, as you like double click on that, right? Go deeper, understand, is there any, you know, oh, wow, you know, that percentage actually seems very low. Like, would there be any barriers, right, for women to access your product, et cetera, right? Or on the contrary, like, wow, that's really high, right? You know, what are some of the patterns that you see here around, say, the loyalty or retention of those customers? And I think so we found that worked. It was kind of, you know, digestible and memorable enough. I mean, even as we were adding new team members to actually use, right? But at the same time, it forced, I think, both our own team and then the companies to actually think, right, about like, oh, what actually is most relevant for this business? Where can we go deeper? Maybe, I mean, I can give, an example. I think that always makes it a bit more real. Again, let me do that. So a recent company that we made was into a company in Vietnam, where I'm based. It's a provider of STEM education for K-12 as well as adults, right? So this company actually does happen to be a women-led business with very strong diversity amongst the board and management team. And so that definitely is great to know. That's something, you can just see from looking at the simple numbers, right? But, I think that is just the very first, like, tip of the iceberg, right, when it comes to doing our gender analysis. I think where we had some really interesting insights was when we dived deeper into understanding how they thought about, what was the role that gender played in their business, right? And I think, as we all know, the representation of women and girls in STEM is not where we would want it to be, right? And we saw immediately that the team had identified this issue as well, right? And were actually addressing it from multiple angles, right? On one side, they were beginning to, they were offering, say, scholarships for women and girls, right, to attend their classes, right? They were also trying to conduct, trying to change the perception, right, amongst parents that, hey, coding is for boys only, or coding is for men. But they actually went, so that was great, but they actually even went one step further. They were like, okay, like, we understand that the dominant social norm in society is that, coding is for men. Women just naturally may not be as, aren't going to be as good at it. They're going to find it hard to get a job, right, if they become coding. I mean, even reading or watching some of the customer testimonials or feedback, it was interesting, like some of the, very strange perceptions, like, oh, if my daughter studies coding and gets a job in that space, she'll never get married, right? So all kinds of different perceptions that they had to overcome. So that, okay, this is the society that we're working in. What can we do, right, to help change that? So what they actually did was they launched a whole new course, which was in the STEM field, but not actually coding. So it was, so they launched actually a number of courses. So one of them was more focused on, say, digital media and digital arts. They also launched one on product management, and I think also one on, on digital marketing, right? And those types of skills. And I guess those, at least in say the Vietnamese context, are a bit more gender neutral, right? And it was easier to actually find women and girls who would study those courses, right, and parents as well. So when they did this, the female enrollment was actually 2x the previous number. So it's actually a very substantial improvement, right, well, frankly, in also their revenues, right, in terms of actually being able to tap into a whole new segment who previously might have just not been interested in kind of pure coding classes. So that's an example of, I mean, and that kind of also was stemmed a little bit into portfolio management, right? Because I think we had some of these initial conversations where we were doing due diligence. I think some of these richer insights that we got were only over time, right? And actually through the result of many conversations. But I think you can see how, I think that there's definitely a very strong impact angle to this. I think our values were aligned between ourselves and the management team. But there's also a great business proposition. I mean, because literally 50% of the population could be studying these types of, courses, but nobody's really targeting them, right? And I mean, again, as we all know, you would be missing out a huge talent pool, right, and customer base if you don't tap into that market. So I think, we're really glad that this company was able to go, or is still going along with us on this journey, right? But it definitely was about engaging more women in the business, but was also, about like, wow, there's like a whole new product suite we can launch, right? And product, there's a huge shortage of, say, product managers in Vietnam, tech product managers. Let's get, let's fill that, right, with more diverse candidates, and that was very exciting to see.
Talking about investors in the fund. Do you I mean, I think I just want to hear from you if you hear challenges, or have you faced challenges in the course of raising funds yourself, convincing investors of different types, those who may not have gender focus, how do you convince them that around the fund thesis and around the fact that he will continue to do gender smart investing?
I think this comes back to being really clear about what each fund's thesis is, right? I mean, so as mentioned, we have, two of our funds which are really focused on GLI, right? I mean, that's front and center of the value proposition. I think, to be honest, with those funds, we would definitely be going to funders or LPs who do have an intrinsic interest in, who are part of 2X, who are supporting this movement, right? However, I would say, as mentioned, we also have funds where gender is one of the considerations, but not necessarily the primary one. I think in those cases, to be honest, I think it's, again, I would say, again, not the reason why, investors who don't really care about gender, it's not the reason why they would invest, right? No, but I really haven't heard any strong objections, right? I think it was actually more curiosity about like, hey, what's this, right? And I think when we give examples like the one that I just shared, they actually see like, oh, that makes sense, right? It's not like some of the, I guess, fears or concerns, right, about maybe having a strong gender lens. So for example, like, oh, if you're focusing on female entrepreneurs, then you won't find the right, you won't find enough pipeline, or like, oh, is this focus on gender going to distract you from, or the companies, right, from from delivering strong financial returns. I think as long as we can answer those types of questions to show how gender actually is kind of expanding the pool of opportunities rather than kind of shrinking it, right? Because I think that's the main fear, right? It's like, oh, okay, by focusing on gender, you've just shrunk the pool of pipeline opportunities. You've also made it harder for yourself to due diligence. Like, who would want to put up with all these questions that you have about gender, et cetera? I think once we can kind of, show how those concerns aren't really well founded, then it is possible to, then I think we can say like, hey, we are, gender analysis is something we do, right? And then that wouldn't raise any red flags, say, on the part of a potential LP.
What would be your advice? As some of them do already have a gender thesis, a thesis around gender in their fund mandates. Others may still be thinking about it or making a beginning. What would be your advice in terms of where should they start from, or where does one start from?
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, and from our own experience, I think my biggest advice is kind of just get started, even in some small way, right? Because I think, as I shared from our own story, we tried some things and frankly, some of them didn't work out at all, right? And we're like, oops, go back and, refine and, reimagine what that could be. So, I think we always say, like, don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good, right? I think that was big learning for us. And I think there's often, I think maybe when you get into the space, you're like, oh, I don't want to put a foot wrong, right? I want to really, be, because it clearly, I mean, it's a very nuanced topic that we're trying to tackle, right? And then, gender norms, social norms, so complex, like, where do you even begin? I think I felt that way too, but I think you just got to start, and yeah, sure, it won't be perfect, right? And I think some of the assumptions that you might make might be a bit kind of basic or crude, right? Or simplistic or generalizing. That's okay, right? I think it's a place to start. I think it's better to kind of dive in, gather some baseline information, right, on your portfolio companies, right? Or if you're an LP, gather some information from your GPs, right? I mean, just ask these questions, get some of this data, right? Learn how, your companies or GPs are thinking about this. And that often can be enough to just inspire kind of the next step, right? One step at a time. And I think the other thing that I would say is, I think for us, a really, really important part of it was making sure that this wasn't some kind of like check the box exercise, right? Or like compliance type of exercise, but really trying to build conviction and momentum amongst our whole team, right? That this does add value, right, to the investment process. And that was really a change management exercise. I think it was really about sharing a lot of examples, practical examples, so people could feel like, oh, okay, this does relate to my job. Like, I'm not going to wait for like the impact team or the gender team to come and like do some analysis for me, right, on these types of issues. I'm going to do that analysis, right? So I think helping, I think showing the link between, I guess, the impact and business side, which is often there, not always, I think was helpful for us, and lots of, just experience sharing, practical examples, and, and bringing it up again and again. Which actually leads me to one final point, if I may, which is, it's like, I think ideally for us, you know, or we've really tried, as I've described, to make it like not a check the box, right, but a really organic part of the process. I think that's true, but I think in the beginning you might need some reminders of checkpoints. We certainly did, right? So we did, you know, we did have to check the box in some ways, right? We're like, okay, in each investment memo, you are going to write this section on gender, right? And then at least not necessarily with a very predetermined structure, which then puts people back to that check the box mindset perhaps, but you are going to write about it, and we're going to talk about it in every investment committee. So I think things like, so these kind of signposts, right, or checkpoints, right, can be helpful. And then I think over time, you may not need them as much, right? But I think at the beginning, yes, if you're changing people's, you know, if you're changing a process, right, that's something that is helpful to get started. Yes, I think it is quite different. So let me take each step, right? So firstly, like, who do we invest in, right? So I think one very clear-cut thing is at Beacon, like 100% of the companies that we invest in are women-owned, women-led businesses, right? 100%. So I think often you could be like, you know, 30% I've seen as like different like women-focused funds. It's 100% for Beacon. So that's already quite okay. That's number one, of course. And then I think the second piece is for Beacon, we focus a lot more on, I think, the gender practices, both within the company and amongst, say, the customers, right, or suppliers of that company. I think we do ask some of the same questions for our say, let's say, like non-core gender funds, right? But I think the level that we go into would be kind of a lot deeper, I would say, and really want to check that kind of values alignment between the management team and us. So for example, the company that I talked to you about, this STEM education company is actually from the Beacon Fund, right? And I think that level of kind of richness, right, in terms of what they're doing, how they're developing their products, et cetera, that's maybe kind of a better example of what we would be doing at Beacon, right? I think for the Patamar 1 and Patamar 2 are more venture capital funds. You know, I think we're looking at impacts on low-income populations more broadly, right? I think it does so happen that oftentimes, actually, the majority of the customers would be women. So I think, again, naturally, it does play into some of our considerations. But yeah, again, it would be like, as long as it's having an impact on low-income communities in general, right? Not necessarily, you know, majority women. It would still be a great fit, right? I think the other piece is in the whole decision-making process, right? So I think for our, for say Beacon and our other, like, you know, core of the core kind of gender funds, we really tried to focus on having a balanced and diverse IC, and diverse, right? Doesn't mean that they're all women, but I think very strong focus on making sure that, I guess it at least was like 40-40-20, right? So 40% women, 40% men, and 20% of either gender, that type of idea, right? Whereas, again, I think it would be nice to have a, you know, diverse IC as part of some of our other funds, but it wasn't like a fact. Again, I think maybe that's sometimes where, you know, more from the LP level, they're like, oh, did you just structure this more around like diversity considerations, or are these actually the best people? I know it's often that would have been the best IC anyway, but these types of questions might come into play. This is an interesting one, right? So I think, and we've done this both in our companies where, say, gender is just one consideration. I mean, so I think by definition, like if we're investing in women-led businesses, they're already actually very diverse. And actually quite interesting, sometimes they're actually far majority women, right? And then we're like, oh, what should be the right kind of incentive, right, for these types of businesses when they're already, the business is like 80 to 90% women? Would we ask them to hire more men? It's very interesting type of consideration. But I think in the ones where, let's say, we are faced with a situation where, you know, it is actually a majority of male leaders in the business and in the workforce, yeah, we've done a couple of things. I think so I think number one is we've really tried, you know, as an equity investor, right, for these funds, we do have a board seat, right? We are somewhat involved on key hiring decisions. We've really, I think we've actually insisted in some cases that there's at least, you know, a diverse pool of candidates, right, being considered for senior hires. And I think actually made that, yeah, mandated that, and I think also really tried to encourage the companies to tap into the networks in different ways, right, to find those senior female hires. So I think that's one. I think like another piece, this is interesting. I mean, this is also another example from our own experience, right? I mean, we have invested in companies where there's 100% male board, 100% male management team, right? Definitely happened before. And even our own board representative was also a man. What I think was really interesting in that scenario was that, you know, one of my business partners actually was able to champion, I guess, bring up gender questions, right, in that context, which, you know, people are like, oh, like, you know, what's the hope, right, for this company, which is 100%, you know, at you know, board, 100% management team, there's really no diversity at all. How on earth could you be thinking about doing gender lens investing? Actually, we did. So I think he began to ask questions around, I think even actually in the business, right? So I think this particular company, it turned out that 80% of their customers were women. And actually, I think they didn't know at the time. He asked them at the board meeting once, and they were like, oh, you know, we don't really know. But to their credit, by the next board meeting, they actually did find out that 80% of their customers were women. They were like, oh, that's a lot, right? That's interesting. And had actually been, then, you know, once that kind of very basic fact, I have to say, was known to them, they actually began to deep dive and ultimately, I guess, tweak and pivot some of their marketing strategies, right, to focus more on female customers. So I think that was one, like even in context of, I guess, a non-promising context, right? They were able to bring some gender considerations to the table. That was step one. I think step two, over time, this company actually hired, I think, 2 very senior women, is from what I understand, because again, we just kept on reminding them, like, next time, you know, next senior hire you make, it has to be a woman, right? Or at least there has to be a woman in the consideration pool. And I think over time, we were able to shift that. I think we definitely saw that between, I guess, the more, like from the more like kind of tech startup world, right, versus the more, say, SME, small, medium enterprise world, I think there were very different kind of support needs required. And I'll get to the gender piece in a sec, right? I think, but in general, I mean, the tech startups, they tended to be, you know, I think a little bit more savvy, right? More experienced fundraising. I think a little bit more kind of international experience and kind of outlook, right, in their businesses. I think once we started focusing, you know, once we set up a different fund, right, which focused more on SMEs, we realized that I think for many of them, you know, say, like raising from an international fund was completely new to them, right? They really didn't know where to begin. They also didn't know about some questions of like, oh, you know, would debt or equity, right, be a better fit for my business, right? Or what's the right capital structure that I should employ in my business? So I think we found that a lot of support was, or an education, right, was needed, even answering some of these basic questions. I think one big piece is that I think because venture capital and private equity has been so prevalent, right, as what's happening in Southeast Asia, that often the companies wouldn't really even know that there were other options out there, right? Or think about, I guess, debt or mezzanine structures as an option, right? Because it's either raise money from angels, raise money from VCs, or like, or you know, don't, or fund your business organically, right? Those were the kind of 2 options on the table. I think that's now changing. So I think a lot of education was required there. I think as far as gender is concerned, I think what we did notice is, you know, I think women did certainly, I think we did notice a gap, right, in the information accessibility and availability that they had. I think they tended not always to have access, again, came back to that network problem, right? Not, they didn't have access to the same kind of, you know, networks. They couldn't ask, say, or they were less likely to have, say, another fellow entrepreneur, right, who'd been through that experience of raising capital to ask for advice. So we did see that there was, again, you know, I think even greater need, right, for kind of reliable kind of information, right, on these types of questions from the entrepreneurs. As for the differences by countries, I would say, yeah, I think, I mean, similar, honestly, like I think similar questions coming up time and time again, right, in the emerging markets where we look, which is predominantly Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. I think, yeah, sure. I think on the tech side, right, Indonesia is a bit more sophisticated, has just had a lot more capital than say Vietnam or the Philippines. But I think for the most part, similar themes, right, in the types of questions that that we might encounter. I think maybe one final thought here is we're looking at maybe, I think what we saw is that for many, at least of the women founders that we know, it is often like kind of a new experience for them to be, running, say 100-person business, right? And having that kind of scale really rapidly. So I think we're thinking about kind of implementing, say, some leadership coaching, right, programs, right, for them. Again, not necessarily because they like need it more than men or something like that, but because it's true. I think, frankly, they do have a lot more to contend with, right, in terms of social norms and stereotypes, right, and doing business as a woman that say a man might not have to face in the same context. Yeah, I think a really interesting question. I think let me speak about both on the debt side and the equity side, right? Because I think for us, as mentioned, we launched a debt fund. I think one of the beautiful parts about debt, even though I guess is doesn't sound there's a kind of a negative connotation about debt, but I think one of the great things is that the investor can have an exit right after a predefined period, 3, 4, 5 years, right? It's self-liquidating, and and both sides can walk away, right, without forcing the entrepreneur to, say, change their business, right, or sell it, et cetera, right? So I think that's on the debt side. So I think we saw like, hey, actually, that does in some ways answer that exit question. I think on the equity side, that's an interesting one. I think where we have played a role, so I think people ask like, hey, can you actually offer just different terms, right, or take gender into account when issuing a term sheet? So let me talk about some of the specific things that we've done. I think the biggest one is we have seen a lot of very messy cap tables when we invest, right, where we have felt that the female co-founder, right, was not being adequately rewarded, right, for her role in really putting together the business, right, and running the business. I think it's a pretty well-known fact. I mean, apart from the gender pay gap, right, there's the equity gap, right, for founders. Women, I think, have only, 39 cents, right, of equity for founder equity, right, versus, for every dollar that a male founder would have. So it's pretty significant. I think in the ways that where we have decided to invest, we say, hey, before we invest, you will need to clean up this cap table, or at least the founder share component, and literally reallocate some of the equity held by the men to the women. Again, it's like not just because like, but we do see, yeah, it's really about like, hey, all of you are. It's really about motivation, right, and aligning interests for the long term of the business. And I think once we've had the conversation in those terms, it's a bit of a sensitive and tough conversation, I won't deny, but I think we have had some results in actually, making that happen right before our investment. And I think, unless you start correctly there, it's very hard in like 7 years' time to walk away and really think about an equitable exit, right, for the founders. There's of course many other aspects to it, but I think this is the one where we've actually been able to, we have some experience like actually doing something about it, right? Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, I think we're really glad to be part of building the data set here. I would say it's probably not conclusive, right, given the time frame for, as all fund managers say, right, it's often too early to tell. But I think our preliminary evidence actually shows that our Investing in Women fund on the equity side was actually our best performing fund so far, right? Which I think is an interesting, somewhat anecdotal point. I know, of course, is the sample size big enough? No, right? Is the time frame long enough? No. But I think that in terms of like, directionally correct, right? I think that's a very promising sign. I think on the debt side, I mean, I think one thing, that one's definitely too early to tell. The fund's only been around for basically 2 years, so couldn't really say. But I mean, I think one thing we're very passionate about proving out, right, to the market is, I think it's commonly said that, say in microfinance, right, women make better borrowers, or they're a better credit risk, right? On the SME side, I think there's definitely some data. I think there's room to kind of contribute to that data set and really build that case for, for gender. And I think that's something we hope to do through the Beacon Fund, through showing, hey, actually, investing in SMEs, women-led SMEs is a better credit risk as well in our markets, right? But we're not quite there yet.